I'm Josh Wilson, Director of Operations at the Music Inclusion Coalition. The Music Inclusion Coalition and the Preservation Project is a 501c3 organization. The Preservation Project podcast is funded by listeners like you. All donations are tax deductible. If you'd like to submit your art to our archive, you can go to our website, www.musicinclusioncoalition.com. We accept art regardless of polish level or ability level. Your art is worth preserving. Enjoy the episode.
In this episode of the Preservation Project podcast, we discuss deaths of queer community members during the AIDS epidemic. We also discuss 3 members of the queer community that were killed in the last year. Their names are Next Benedict, Sam Nordquist, and Jonathan Joss. These are only the deaths that have made national news. Deaths in the queer community happen every day and do not make national, state, or even local news broadcasts. We want to acknowledge that the data highlighting violence against the queer community is underreported and that violence against those in our community that are in other marginalized communities suffer at a far higher rate. During this Pride Month, we dedicate this episode to those in the queer community who have lost their lives too soon, reported or not. I am super excited to have you here today. We met through the kind of network that is the Bay Area music and queer kind of scene. And so I'm super excited to bring you in to talk with us about queer art during Pride. So happy Pride. If you can introduce yourself and give us some background because you're doing a lot of really cool things.
Happy Pride. I am so glad to be here. Thank you. You're right. We met through sort of this queer music network that is in the Bay Area that seems to just keep weaving. The web just keeps going and going, which is amazing. My name is Thomas Kurtz. For folks who don't know, I use he, him pronouns. I am a musician. I'm a arts administrator. I'm a teacher. So I do a lot of different things, but all really centering around music and social justice and producing and queer history. So really excited to talk about some of the things that I'm doing as of late in the Bay Area and the exciting things coming up for Pride Month. It's going to be great.
Yeah, so I want you to start with your dissertation. I think that's kind of how we connected was I saw you on Facebook, kind of saw like what you had been up to, and I asked a mutual friend to connect us because it looked so cool. And so kind of everything that we've been up to and sort of in our wheelhouse. So I wanted to chat with you. So tell us a little bit about kind of your start, how you ended up doing the dissertation you did, and a little bit more info about that.
Yeah, so a little backstory. I finished my doctorate of musical arts degree at the University of Texas at Austin back in 2023. I spent 4 years there, and I did my dissertation on the formal title is Music as a Catalyst for Social Change During the AIDS Crisis in San Francisco among LGBTQ plus communities. So I was really researching how music was transformative for folks that were indirectly and directly affected by the AIDS crisis, specifically within the time period of 1981 to 1996. So that's where my focus was, but it was really centered too in San Francisco. So I would be back and forth a lot to San Francisco while I was doing that work in Austin. And I reached out to a bunch of folks that I had found just through knowing people and them connecting me with other people and reading about folks who are still in the Bay Area, who are activists during the height of the crisis. And by reaching out to these folks, I was able to interview them. I was able to get to know them, become friends with them. It was really an incredible, I say that whole journey was really an incredible experience, because what you find is that so many folks who were affected by the AIDS crisis during the height of the AIDS crisis really hadn't had a chance to speak about it, to tell their story, to do it without fear of being judged, to do it without stigma. And so a lot of those interviews and a lot of those chats with those people were very emotionally charged. So much so that in between those, I really had to take breaks. Like I couldn't do an interview after another interview after another interview because it was just too taxing, right? And now, sort of being on the other side of this, post dissertation, post this research in that way, I've become close with a lot of the folks that I've interviewed and gotten to know them even more, which has been such a privilege and an honor. And I'm immensely grateful because I never imagined I would have this opportunity to live in this city, in this part of the country that is so radically inclusive and is one of the really most rewarding places to be doing this kind of work. I sort of took a leap after I finished my dissertation and my doctorate degree. I didn't have a job set up. I didn't have connections other than the ones that I fostered while I was in Austin. So I just moved to the Bay Area because I knew it was a place that I wanted to be in. I moved to San Francisco. I saved up a certain amount of money while I was pursuing my doctorate degree. And I told myself, you have this amount of time. You have this amount of time to make something work. And hopefully, that happens. And if not, we have to go to contingency plan. And so I moved here and I say luck, I was lucky, but also I want to honor that there's a fair amount of hard work that went into it too. So it's a mixture of work ethic and being in the right place at the right time that sort of got me the gigs that I have now and have allowed me to live relatively comfortably in the Bay Area, which is saying a lot because it is an expensive place to be in. But
place.
Yes, very expensive place. But I do feel like I've really carved out a unique position for myself in this beautiful community here.
Yeah.
And I could go on and on, but
yeah, no, speaking to your point on part of it is luck, part of it is hard work. I think also honoring the queer community in the sense of I have at least felt like the community is always there to help and support in so many ways. And so like even having a few connections, I just feel like that is something about the community that I've always loved. And I just wanted to share that is that willingness to help and to offer support. And I think, you can probably speak to that really well in terms of also your research is something that was huge during the AIDS crisis, was the ways in which the community supported each other through art, through drag, through dance, through music, and culture, because the mainstream wasn't, right? Like that is a big part of where the art kind of came in and intersected and was both a form of support and protest, was that the community was being ignored, and there were lesbians that stepped up, there were trans women that were leading the charge of activism, and so all of those pieces of kind of like we have always had to be there for each other because no one else was there, and I feel like that's really like continued on, but I like honoring that history of that, and if you can share like more to that point.
Absolutely. So you bring up a lot of really great points here, but what rings to me is this idea of San Francisco as a safe haven for a lot of people, thinking about the AIDS crisis, thinking about now. A couple weeks ago, I went on Juanita's List on Facebook, which is a LGBTQ housing group, right? And you see all these posts of folks who are moving to San Francisco because they want to be their true authentic selves in a place that's inclusive and looking for people to connect to get them into housing that might be affordable, right? That same kind of mentality existed when the LGBTQ plus community was being still is, but in different ways, like directly targeted by government, stigmatized in all sorts of different ways, and we're suffering from. I'm thinking of this in terms of the AIDS crisis, but we're suffering from this disease that people didn't understand, and because people didn't understand it, they didn't want to know or learn about it, and So there weren't resources that were available anywhere for folks that were suffering from, HIV and AIDS. I mean, for years, it was called gay-related immune deficiency. That's what the New York Times posted. That's what other notable media sources posted. And it wasn't until a few years into the epidemic that we actually got autoimmune deficiency syndrome. And we learned a little bit more about the virus and what it meant for the people that it was affecting, what it meant for communities, not only in San Francisco, but throughout the world, right? But how lots of folks were coming to San Francisco, going to New York, but San Francisco is really the first AIDS model of care that was established. And so folks, you find a lot of them are coming to San Francisco to get the care, to get the treatment that they needed. And that's why AIDS affected a large portion of people here in San Francisco, especially the Castro district, which is one of the first, quote, gayborhoods in the country.
I have actually not heard it referred to as a gayborhood. I'm disappointed in my friends here for not using that more.
Yeah, lots of gayborhoods.
Yeah, lots of. I mean, San Francisco is a gayborhood now, but speaking of, I think the lack of education around it and weaving in the art piece, I actually worked for a queer theater, which I will give a shout out to. So if you're in the Bay Area or visiting the Bay Area, you should definitely check out New Conservatory Theater Center. They are in Civic Center area. Check them out. They are one of the oldest queer theaters in the country, if not the world. And they actually came out of the lack of education. They started by educating high school age students about AIDS and HIV and how, to practice safer health practices, not explicitly either. It wasn't like about sex, but it was through the storytelling art form of theater and how we can be safer because there was no one doing that work. And it's since expanded into this huge kind of epicenter for theater and queer theater and has built the queer canon. People like Coleman Domingo have come out of there and still write world premieres for them. But it really came out of specifically originally the education piece and then the fact that these stories weren't being told and no one was talking about it. No one was sharing. And so when I worked there, I was a fundraising person and I got to talk, just to your point at the beginning, with a lot of these older men who had been there since the beginning of this theater that had lived in the city, predating the AIDS epidemic, and just hearing their stories. And like you said, that no one really has asked still. That's still something that is being uncovered very slowly. But there's still a lot of shame around it. I mean, there's still so much stigma around the queer community that we're seeing right now. And so I think that's just something that you touched on was that stigma is still very much there. And I would like to point out that we did start Pride Month yesterday, and we've already heard about deaths related to being queer, being killed for being queer. I think, I can think of 3 in the last year off the top of my head that made national headlines for just how disgustingly violent it was. And so I think that, it's easy to say like, oh, there is no stigma, Target's carrying Pride apparel, but these men are still not fully speaking out about it. It still carries a lot of shame. It's still an illness that is seen very shamefully around the world in a lot of regards.
And it's still something that even though we have treatment for it, there are folks that are taking loads of medication every day just to stay afloat, who have been diagnosed early on and are, amazingly are still here with us. And it's incredible. But these folks are still suffering from related complications. We can't forget that. You're right, we can't forget the stigma that still comes along with revealing your status or being queer too in spaces where it's still very unsafe, especially amidst this administration right now that's directly targeting trans communities and trans communities of color. And the lack of education that's with healthcare professionals in particular about HIV and AIDS, and how that sort of manifests today, right? If I could give a small example, when I was in Austin, I went to my primary care physician. I mean, it was the first time I was seeing them, and they were asking me why I was there, and I was feeling really run down. I had chills, like classic flu symptoms, but I was also losing a little bit of weight. So all of these that are, common symptoms for anyone that's suffering from a flu or a really bad cold. But immediately my primary care physician is like, have you got tested for AIDS? And I was like, are you like seriously asking me this question right now? Like that you're like, you assume, because, I mean, the question that came before it was like, how do you identify sexually? So, she's assuming because I'm a gay man, because I'm resembling symptoms that were of folks with AIDS when there was no treatment for it, that could be something that is, something that I'm suffering from without like any without any awareness. There's such like a lack of knowledge, and I was surprised with like a healthcare professional, but that's, going like 4 years ago, so not like, super far away from now.
Yeah, I think that that's a huge thing is even the AIDS epidemic, I think we refer to it in a way that is so far in the past. And it really isn't. Like these people are still here, and they're young, a lot of them that were there. I mean, they're running organizations still, like I said, the queer theater I worked at, that still has its founder. Like he is still running this organization, and he lived through the AIDS epidemic, and he is still young and spry, and it really isn't that long ago. And I think a big part of it is that we aren't necessarily being taught our history. I think that that's a huge part of it is queer people don't know our history, and so straight people really don't know our history. I think it was really interesting. I said something recently to a friend that is straight about some of like the classic dynamics in the queer community about which letters are more important and represented, and she just like had no idea that was like a very specific part, like that was a very common problem within the community. And I thought that was fascinating because like I thought it was so talked about, but it's only talked about in our community. And so I think that that's a big thing, and that's something that I've loved about a lot of the art that's coming out of our community right now. I think is doing a really good job really sharing the history. I think Pose is like one of the best examples I can like come up with as of late. Is like it really was entertaining. It was fabulous. I mean, Billy Porter is to die for always.
Amazing.
Oh my god, I saw him live recently and it was incredible. He's just amazing. So he grand marshaled SF's Pride Parade, I think like last year or 2 years ago.
Yeah.
He's amazing. So he's, very much like out and about in the community, not just in like the elite community, but like is here in city, like grassroots, and is sharing those stories and really highlighting, I think especially in that series, something that I loved was that it highlighted Black trans women. I say Black trans women, also women of color that are trans, especially in that series, because I think that's the history we know the least about, that has been the least talked about, the least widely shared. But it was like a very mainstream show, and it became very mainstream. I think it started out kind of more under the radar, and it blew up. Like people saw that, and there are more conversations about ballroom, about the fact that Madonna took Vogue from that community, that just all of these things that were kind of not really talked about or touched upon.
Yeah. What you're describing, trans communities and trans communities of color, ballroom culture. And it all reminds me of, so I teach at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. I also teach at the University of San Francisco, professional development, career development, and also queer history and music. So lots of different types of things, but they all kind of weave together, which is really cool. Anyway, one of the lectures that I gave to my queer music, it's called Music and Queer Community course, is on the history of disco music, and disco in New York, and then disco in San Francisco, and then disco throughout the country. But what folks don't usually know, or what the class was surprised to know about disco, is that it really started in underground ballroom culture with Black trans communities in New York. And then from there evolved to what it became, this huge mainstream thing that really just blew up, right? We start off like in the early days of disco, with disco not even being a genre of music, but really being like a place where people go to dance with a DJ, right? Like it was just a place to celebrate, where, as you know, folks noticed that a lot of these records were selling really well. They were becoming hits in other nightlife spaces, and so it started to get super commodified, right? And a lot of mainstream artists start to dabble in disco, which is cool, but not really recognizing the root of, you know, where it came from. And then, you know, it's not until the height of it where like Sylvester comes out, and Sylvester being a huge queer icon, especially in San Francisco, with his hit "You Make Me Feel Mighty Real," which becomes one of the, you know, highest selling, chart-topping Billboard singles to be released. And that is one of like the definitive sort of disco anthems. But then it's really soon after that disco starts to take a turn in what becomes sort of known as like the disco demolition riot. I'm not sure if you heard about this.
Vaguely, but you can fill me in on all the details that I don't know.
Yeah, it's this event. Oh my gosh, I don't know if it happened in 78 or 79, but it's this event that took place in Chicago, in Kaminsky Park in Chicago, where a local DJ organized a disco demolition where everyone could get into the stadium for a reduced price if they had a disco record with them, like a vinyl, and everyone would take those records and smash them in the middle of like the ballpark, lit them on fire. Like it was this whole like end of disco event that happened, which was kind of wild. And like, yes, it was a very like site specific thing, but like it became a nationwide like phenomenon. Like everybody knew about this. It was on the news. It was sort of this event that we can't sort of displace from the queer Black history that it was built on, right? So there's a lot of maybe the word I'm looking for, a lot of, oh my gosh, I can't think of the word, subliminal homophobia and racism entangled in that event. And the people who organized it have yet to like acknowledge sort of what disco is built on and why the event was as big as it was. But disco, especially for people with AIDS and people in, you know, larger cities like San Francisco or New York, that music really became, you know, a way to have some hope, to be uplifted, to dance in the midst of an epidemic.
Well, there's that quote, what is it? We bury our dead at morning, we protest during the day, and we dance at night. That's a not exact quote. That is paraphrasing, but that was very much part of the culture. I think very much still is, at least I can't speak for the whole country, but very much at least here in the city is still very much part of the culture is these, it is the club scene, and not even just for going out and drinking or dancing, but really for building that community that is very much still the heart of, I think, the community is still the Castro here. It is starting to move, I think, for queer women especially, and queer people that don't identify as male into some other parts of the city, but at least in the Bay is still very much tied to these clubs, which do tend to be very inclusive, even in terms of like sobriety and things like that, because it's more about physically being there than like the party scene or any of that. It's very much about the music, it's about the dancing, and it's about like the culture and passing that on, and multi-generation. I think work is really big here, because that history isn't being handed down, because throughout history we're still seeing that that I guess there's just still so much silence, that there still are people that haven't come out because of fear. We're still not that far past it, and so we're still seeing so little information that's not being handed down generationally. And then it's very different from something like ethnicity or race or culture, in a sense of like you're not handing it down from parent to child in the same way that you would food recipes. Like this is, you might not have a child that is also gay, you might not have children at all, and so that culture doesn't, I think, trickle down the same way. That history gets lost, and so I think that's still a big part of what we see here, is trying to capture that and share it through music, through art, through these other means and methods.
And I also think it's not passed on even from folks who were affected or know a lot about the virus, because there's this idea that and true, like that there's a lot of darkness in the midst of the AIDS crisis and in the midst of that history. And that darkness oftentimes clouds the light that folks saw in the midst of that epidemic, because you had to keep hope alive. There had to be something that kept you going, right? And when people reminisce, for instance, it's often really dark. It's cathartic, but it's very dark. And if I can bring amidst of some agency and light that I found in doing the work that I did, it was actually in conversations with Reverend Jim Mitulski, who was the Reverend at the Metropolitan Community Church in San Francisco during most of the AIDS crisis, the height of the AIDS crisis. And the Metropolitan Community Church was one of the first LGBTQ plus affirming churches, started in Los Angeles, that went to New York and San Francisco. And what the Metropolitan Community Church did that was different from a lot of other denominational spaces was that they held funerals for people with AIDS. A lot of times you found that the churches that folks with AIDS belonged to initially wouldn't hold funerals for them because either they had AIDS or they were gay, or whatever the reason might be. But so they held a lot of funerals at the Metropolitan Community Church, and folks who knew that they were going to die, which was anybody diagnosed with AIDS, it was a death sentence. You just assumed that was going to happen. As dark as that is, and as heavy as that is, these folks also had the opportunity to plan their end of life, to plan their funeral, to plan how they were going to be mourned, how they were going to be celebrated, how they were going to be remembered. And speaking in terms of art and activism and music in this way, that was often the thing that folks who were planning their funerals had the most agency over. I've interviewed a number of folks who well, Jim told me about a couple of folks whose funerals that he I guess I don't know the word for it, initiated or
Presided over, yeah.
Yeah. And folks would request all different types of songs to be performed by the congregation. Sometimes by the SF Gay Men's Chorus would come in and play. Sometimes they've had folks from the symphony come and play for them too. And so you found people who wouldn't necessarily be in this space come together in this space because that was the wish of somebody and how they wanted to be celebrated, right? Everything from disco and pop classics to gospel music, which has a long history in queer communities, to very traditional Catholic hymns as sort of a reclaiming of sorts, kind of like what we are doing right now with the word queer. And I found that incredibly, empowering for folks to do. What I also noticed is that there were certain parts of these funerals that folks in the congregation or folks that were there for the person who passed could individually honor and commemorate that person who passed. And how did they do this? Oftentimes, you have the full congregation sing, right, along with, whatever the song is. But people who wanted to have solos in the congregation, they could opt to do that. And that would be their way of signaling their, own memorializing of a person. And then everybody else would repeat. So it's not so much this call and response from two different sides, but rather it's a call and response like within.
Almost like an echoing versus like in a growing out of that one singular.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Two things that came up for me with that is ways of honoring people. One thing that I love that also is connected to art is the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which has gotten so massive at this point, and is huge, but people make squares to remember loved ones. And that's so beautiful and just so sad. And another thing, when you were talking about the fact that so many people were unable to have funerals, again, just remembering too, like our history, where we come from, how recent this was. This is only 40 years ago. There's a whole island in New York that is mostly men that were not claimed by their families. Their family did not want their body, and so they were put on an island outside of New York City, because like you said, just like here in San Francisco, that was a huge place for gay men. So there were a lot of men living there that passed away and went unclaimed. Their family would rather have them sit on an island by themselves than to take their body home. And so that is a very recent thing, that is 40 years ago. So again, I just think really recalling that, as I think with everything going on in mainstream media, the calls against us, the fact that, people are talking about how we don't need a Pride Month. We do. And I think also in terms of, you brought up the Gay Men's Chorus, which are an incredible, incredible thing across the country. So if you're not supporting your local Gay Men's Chorus, you definitely should be. They are amazing, and they celebrate so much queer joy and have very much expanded. I think at this point they are trying to expand very much past gay men. So if you want to join and you are not a gay man, but you are part of the queer community, I think you are very much encouraged to go do so and reach out to your local chapter. But I just always think of that photo, which again, the art of it and the history of it, where it was, I don't remember when it was taken, but very much past the AIDS epidemic, or wasn't so much, it was like 20 years ago, I want to say.
I think it was, I could be wrong, I think it was 86 or 87.
Okay, yeah. So not really past. But they had and I'm sure people have seen it at this point. It goes around every Pride these days, which I love seeing it, and I hate seeing it because it's so sad. But it's the chorus, and it's they are wearing shirts representative of how many of them are still alive and how many of them have passed. And it's, I think, like 5 or 6 men that are in the white shirts at that point. And that is from the original Gay Men's Chorus. And I think that that's just something that is so haunting. And again, like that importance of art and carrying on the history is when you really see it. And I think we talk about this a lot on this podcast, is how art humanizes us, and that's why during, authoritarian and fascist regimes, when we're trying to, as a society, target a certain group of people, one of the first things they do is cut off art and culture, because that is the one thing that really humanizes us. And I think that photo for me is always something I come back to as that humanizing piece, is you see individual humans that represent someone that has passed away. And I think that is so poignant and so just, again, I can't think of a better word, but truly humanizing, where you see that impact.
So poignant, so humanizing, so powerful. This the SF Gay Men's Chorus and other gala choruses, GALA, which stood for Gay Lesbian Association of Choruses, has since, expanded to queer choruses and trans choruses and a bunch of other LGBTQ plus type choruses in the nation. But SF Gay Men's Chorus, if you go to one of their concerts, you'll get a program, right? And inside of this program, you'll see all the names of the folks that are listed that are performing for you. And oftentimes they're categorized by their voice type. So tenor 1, tenor 2, baritone, bass, usually the 4 sections. But they'll always have a page on the program. Well, it's more than one page on the program that's called their 5th section, which is all the people that have passed from AIDS that were in the chorus. And that list does expand. It gets bigger. Like it's not the same thing that's been printed every year. So this, it's just a reminder it's a reminder to folks that, AIDS is not over and it's still here, and it's important to advocate for AIDS awareness and the allocation of resources, but also that the patrons that are coming to support their arts organizations, to hear them sing, fun parodies, like for their holiday concert, like super fun, super cool, bring your whole family, it's great, it's sold out. Also know, like, our history. Also know that this is part of this, right? And I think that's what makes San Francisco so special, is because you can't really think about art, and you can't really think about music and creativity without thinking about the history and the politics and the activism behind it. Music and art is incredibly political, no matter how much we want to sort of separate them. Everything has a history and everything has a backstory. And that's what I think San Francisco organizations do really well, is educating the public, providing like a pedagogical component to the art that they present to people.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely something I think that's been touched on a lot, and we've talked about it offline this year in terms of a lot of the Pride collections that have come out, is the lack of actual education that's been happening, is, taking these symbols and all these things, and kind of like you talked about with disco, is maybe understanding it, maybe not, but throwing it out there to profit off of without doing that education piece, because I think that that's kind of that fine line that we walk between, representation and, appropriation, commercialization, commodification, all of the cations, is, how, and I think it's a fine line to walk. Do you educate every time? How much do you talk about it? I think that I understand artists that don't always do that. But at the same time, having to acknowledge that and the history that comes with it, because otherwise it's just like, oh, that's a cute little pink triangle on that shirt. And it's like, no, that has a really dark, deep history in the community. And, it's in the Bay, we light it up every year, and it's a big part of our queer history. And it's just kind of like casually thrown on a t-shirt at Levi's. And I think that I think that's a very interesting thing that we're seeing right now, is that intersection of when representation is here and it's so important, but also how do you do it respectfully? And again, acknowledging that there are still people who are living with family members that have passed from AIDS, from hate crimes, from, that friends are still living, and are here, that partners have passed from AIDS, that, that we have community members that are still, we have the intervention now, but they still might have caught it in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and they are still dealing with those repercussions. And how do you give the younger generation that representation without commodifying it and making light of it? Because Pride is so fun. I perform at them throughout the Bay. I love Pride, but it's still a protest. And I think striking that balance of supporting the community and creating that awareness, and also making it something to be celebrated, because we are something to be celebrated. Is I think we're at a very interesting point in history of seeing that, and hopefully it continues to get better. But I do think that's a really interesting point that you brought up.
Yeah, you're mentioning this this sort of educational component to art making and understanding the history around it. Piggybacking off of what I said too, and I'm thinking about an event that I helped produce with the National AIDS Memorial. That was inspired by the AIDS Memorial quilt. What I really found with this particular project is that it was going to be important for it to be intergenerational, and for there to be an aspect of teaching and learning from multiple generations, right? And if I could speak briefly about this project, I think it's really cool. For World AIDS Day every year, the National AIDS Memorial Grove here in San Francisco holds a fundraiser, and it's called Light in the Grove, and it is the evening before World AIDS Day. And it's a large fundraising event. Usually there's about 700 plus attendees, and it's like a gala. And so folks come, they walk through the grove, they experience all the lights and the sounds, and then they go into this tent and they eat and they drink and they enjoy music, and they get to donate if they want to, all these things, right? I was asked by John Cunningham, who's the executive director, wonderful individual, last year to help coordinate and produce the entertainment and the music, the dancing, etc. for that evening. So this was a really exciting opportunity, because I knew that I would be able to tap all of these different community partners that I've had in the Bay Area, bring them together, and make this event something really special, something really historically informed, but also something, motivating for younger generations too, in the way that they look at their own arts activism and own activist scholarship work. And so folks from USF, folks from San Francisco Conservatory of Music, performers, engineers, folks from like all different backgrounds were going to come, and they were going to offer their talents to perform in the Grove. And we also invited folks from Open House, one of the first LGBTQ senior centers that's right here in San Francisco, to join as well. And so we crossed about 4 different generations here, and what we, so this was a long process, but what I did was I solicited feedback from folks who attended the event previously. I asked them, what did they like? What didn't they like? What do they want to see? What could have been different, etc. Right? And the intergenerational collaboration was one thing that they were really interested in doing. They wanted to see more of themselves, their lived experiences in the work that was being created. They also wanted to co-create. They wanted to be a part of the creating of something in this grove, right? So students were paired with elders, mostly to understand their experiences and get to know them, and then work with them to I say compose, but I use this in the most general sense, a piece of music, of entertainment, of something that was going to be featured in the Grove. And so you had this sort of direct collaboration between folks who were musicians and artists, and then folks who were also musicians and artists, but they wouldn't call themselves that. And so varying levels of experience, and then creating something that was based off of these stories that was so unique to the people attending this event, to the communities that were being honored by this event, largely LGBTQ plus communities, and an event in which folks who attended could actively participate in it. So we actually had, when we devised the music that was going to be performed in the Grove while attendees were walking outside of the Grove or around the Grove, we had decided on like 6 different pitches that would resemble a chord, and that would be what the music was based, that would be what the piece is based off of. And so what we did on the side of the Grove was have all of these different wine glasses set up with various amount of water in the wine glasses, and I don't know what the actual instrument is called. It is called something, but folks have probably seen this, where you dip your finger in the water and then graze the rim, and it produces a certain pitch depending on the level of water that's in the wine glass. So when folks were coming through the Grove, they were actually able to participate and be involved in the music making. I'm getting a note.
Sorry, our tech guy Josh says is feeding us the news here, and it is a glass harmonica. Did I say that right?
We're gonna go with it.
This is half the show, is Josh correcting me via chat. But no, I think I'm so glad you brought up that project, because I did see that on your Facebook, and I am so glad you brought up Open House, because I was hoping we would touch on that very briefly, at least. I am obsessed with Open House. I love them. I was making weird faces the whole time you told that story, because like every time I think of Open House, I want to cry.
They're always looking for volunteers, by the way, for anyone who's listening. So go do that. It's amazing.
Do it. So again, back to, a lot of these families wouldn't claim their children when they passed. A lot of these people don't have families still. They potentially have never had kids, because a reminder, we could only marry 10 years ago on a national scale. Some states were sooner. But that also means you couldn't adopt, and there's still a lot of difficulties around IVF and adoption, surrogacy, getting to be a parent as a gay person. So a lot of, especially people that are older right now, had no opportunity, unless they were in a lavender marriage of sorts, whether they knew it at the time or not, to have children. And so they don't have people around. They don't have family. Again, a lot of these are older gay men who a lot of their friends passed away. And so Open House is an amazing senior living community that takes care specifically of LGBTQ plus members, and is a huge part of the community doing this multi-generational work, bringing in younger people to volunteer, to spend time with them, to really keep this history. And I wanted to touch on that as well, because this is a great segue kind of into how we end our podcast. You said something that I loved about the students that are artists, they're in school to be artists, and the members of Open House who probably wouldn't call themselves artists but are. And that is a huge thing we do with our archive work, is we ask for everyone to submit. You do not need to be an official artist. You don't have to have gone to school for it. You don't have to have ever been paid $1 for your art. Please share it with us. it is so important that this history is recorded for anyone from any marginalized community, because this is how this does get handed down. If there aren't, if there's not a lot of cultural awareness in your community, if you don't have people to pass your story along to, saving art, putting that in some sort of written form, in artistic form, in a movie, in a song, in something, is how we hand this down through generations. And it is so, so incredibly important. And that's how our stories get told later. For example, Pose and the ballroom scene. We know that existed because of the art that came out of it. And so please send us your stories. There are links all across our platform, in our bio, everywhere and anywhere. And you can submit your own work. You can share it with us. And we would love to have it. It can be completely, anonymous, completely under lock and key. We won't share with anyone, all the way up until, like, if you want us to share it, we would love to share amazing art from marginalized communities. So there's a whole range of options, but it can absolutely remain completely private. But it is very important to us to save this artwork and to hand it down through generations. So please, please, please share your art. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. We only scratched the surface on the work that you've done, so we are definitely going to bring you back. But this was a super awesome way to kick off the start of Pride, to honor all of the amazing queer people that came before us and who will come after us and that are here right now, because we have always been here. We will always be here. We are not going anywhere. And I just love talking to you, and I love spending time with you. So I'm so grateful for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. It should end on that note, but I have to thank you. Like, this has been, an honor, and I'm so glad that you asked me to come to kick off Pride Month. I'm super stoked.
Okay. Yeah. Happy Pride, everyone. Protect your trans siblings, save the dolls, tip your drag queens. And Pride was a protest. Keep on protesting, keep on sharing your stories, and being loud and proud and gay as hell.